So you say, how could I talk about Australia in Bible prophecy? Australia does not appear in the Bible at all. Well, the name doesn't appear in the Bible, but I want to show you that we can review the events of 2021 in the light of where Australia sits and the events that have unfolded in this past year. And I'm not going to talk about COVID. You'll be relieved it's going to be a COVID-free zone this evening. Also, I'm not going to talk very much about Israel. There was a brilliant talk on Israel in this hall about a month back by Mike Steele, and it's on YouTube, and I encourage you to watch it. So I'm going to talk about Australia. I want to start tonight in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 17. These are words spoken by Daniel the prophet to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and it provides a structure for what we're going to talk about tonight. Daniel 4 is actually written by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Now, this was a great empire. You can go to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin and see the Ishtar Gate, and you can see some of the grandeur of this fabulous city. And Nebuchadnezzar also thought it was a very great city. But in the 17th verse, Daniel said to him that the matter of what is going to happen is by the decree of the watchers. And clearly in this context, the watchers are the angels who are overseeing all the events of the world, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. That's a fundamental part of our understanding of what's happening in our world. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men. However shambolic our world might seem, we come back to this fundamental of the scriptures, that God is in control. He rules. And Nebuchadnezzar had to realize that his power was limited by the control of God. And the prophet goes on to say, God gives it to whomsoever he will. God will select whoever he wants to be the ruler at the time, and sets up over the human kingdoms the basest of men. And we want to think tonight about how God is working the nations through his angels to bring about the final destination of world events, which was told to Daniel in chapter 2, verse 44, that God would set up a kingdom on this earth. So why talk about Australia? Well, I'm really basing much of the talk around one verse in Ezekiel 38, verse 13, that refers to countries in the latter days called Sheba and Dedan and Tarshish and the young lions thereof. And we're going to talk about who the merchant of Tarshish is, who these young lions are, and this will bring Australia into play. But my real interest in this topic was caused by the incredible story that came out on the 16th of September this year in relation to AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US alliance. As someone said, you couldn't have put US first, otherwise it would have been you sucker, and you couldn't have that. So Australia went first, and it was right that Australia went first because it was about Australian submarines. And we had this joint virtual conference between Joe Biden, President of the US, our own Scott Morrison, who of course Joe Biden couldn't remember his name and referred to him as our man from down under, and Boris Johnson from the UK. And they made this announcement. And very rarely does Australia get splashed across the international press. Yeah, okay, when 6 children die in a jumping castle in Devonport, that probably makes the international press. But here is a political event which was splashed all over the papers of the world. And that was because of the reactions of the French and of the Chinese and the Indonesians and other powers right around the world. Of course, this thing was about nuclear submarines. And after persisting with the idea of buying French submarines and getting them somewhat built in Australia, Eventually, they decided to scrap this idea altogether and to go with nuclear submarines, US-UK design. I was interested because I knew some friends in this congregation who were chatting over lunch about how stupid the French submarine deal was and how this would never work. And lo and behold, the next week it was cancelled. So I think these gentlemen might have had some prescience about what was happening in our world. So out came Joe Biden and talked about this partnership, Australia, the UK, US partnership, AUKUS. It sounds strange with his acronym, says Joe, but it's a good one, AUKUS. Our nations will update and enhance our shared ability to take on the threats of the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century together. Our nations and brave fighting forces have stood shoulder to shoulder for literally more than 100 years, from the trench warfare of the First World War to island hopping of World War II, and in Korea together and the Persian Gulf. We've been faithful and capable partners, and we're even closer today. We're taking another step forward to deepen and formalise cooperation among all three of our nations, because we recognise the imperative of ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific over the long term. What's it all about? China. Of course, China never gets mentioned, but everybody knows this is about the perceived threat of China. And our beloved ScoMo, we should be polite, Prime Minister Morrison, said, well, good morning from Australia. I'm very pleased to join two great friends of freedom and of Australia. A next-generation partnership on a strong foundation of proven trust. That's a slight at French, I think. We've always seen the world through a similar lens. We've believed in a world of freedom, respects human dignity, the rule of law, the independence of sovereign states, the peaceful fellowship of nations. We're always together, said Scott Morrison, never alone. So we born this trilateral security partnership, and it's a long history of cooperation. And so today, friends, we recommit ourselves to this cause and a new AUKUS vision. So there was probably the closest link here is between Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison. And this year they not only negotiated this new submarine arrangement, but they also signed a new trade agreement between Australia and the UK, of which I'll talk a little more a little later. Now, of course, we know the French were very upset. Yves Le Drian attacked it as a knife in the back. This is the French foreign minister. A unilateral, brutal, unpredictable decision you'd expect from the Trump administration, not from Biden. Bruno Tertras of France's Foundation for Strategic Research think tank called it a Trafalgar strike. Now, if you thought carefully about Trafalgar strike, the Battle of Trafalgar was a brilliant English military victory under Lord Nelson against the French and Spanish. But after a few weeks, Boris Johnson had enough. He told reporters, I just think this is mixed French-English, it's time for some of our dearest friends around the world to prendre un grip, get a grip, about this, and donnez-moi un break, give me a break. Blending English and French into one succinct, get over it message. And he said it was fundamentally a great step forward for global security. Well, the French haven't got over it yet. I heard Macron this week complaining about what we had done. Even in our own country, we had some people stepping back saying, oh, this is shocking. You know, there was our former wonderful Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, and previous Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and Turnbull saying, I pretended to be Scott's mate for years, so I know firsthand how duplicitous he is. And so was Malcolm Turnbull. And yes, Kevin Rudd's agreeing. Very true, very true. So this week, on Wednesday, I heard this on the news and then it quickly evaporated from the internet. So maybe Macron thought it wasn't good to keep this in the public sphere. He said the Australian government behaved badly when it pulled out of a contract to buy submarines. He said France had retaliated against the Australian move and that its response would continue to make itself felt for a long time. Watch out, you Aussies, the French are coming against you for a very long time. And then very recently, you may have noted that Peter Dutton has just cancelled the previous arrangement with Taipan helicopters for the Australian Army. And instead, he's buying Seahawks and Black Hawks from the Americans. Well, where is the home of the Taipan helicopter? It's an Airbus factory in France, in Aix-la-Provence. So the French have got reason again to feel jilted. Of course, this time it's a French, Dutch, German cooperative arrangement that produces this helicopter, and they were built, many of them in Australia, but they were really lousy helicopters. We've had the Australian Audit Office doing reviews of these helicopters, and you know, the back rotor didn't work and the doors didn't slide. In fact, they then decided that the door was actually too narrow. You couldn't shoot a gun and get men out the door at the same time. It was just hopelessly designed. So Peter Dutton said, enough of this rubbish. At one stage of this year, all these helicopters were grounded because they didn't have enough spare parts to make them operative. But anyway, we're buying Black Hawks. Where do Black Hawks come from? Well, they come from Stamford, Connecticut in the US. We're buying American equipment. So again, we're abandoning the French and buying American. Do you think the French are feeling a little upset? And then with the Olympic partial, sorry, I don't know where we're going here. The Olympic partial boycott of government officials going to the Olympics. Who is not going? Well, old friends. There's no government officials going from the USA, the UK, Canada and Australia. Familiar trend? Yes, we'll let the Europeans go. We don't care if the Chinese are upset. This is what we're going to do. We're not taking government officials to Beijing. So, in 1 year, we've upset the Chinese, the French, the Germans, in fact, most of the European community. When we decided to scrap the French submarine deal, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commissioner, came out and said, this is terrible behaviour. And the Germans came out and said, this is shocking. And we said, we're just going to deal with the French. We'll ignore the Australians from here on. So we seem to have had this great capability to upset the Chinese and the Europeans. And we've clearly, throughout this year, drawn closer to the US, the UK, and India. Now, I am suggesting you from Daniel 4:17 that this is exactly what I would have predicted the angels to have been working on. They want us to be in alliance with our Western partners and disassociated from China and the Europeans. So this is the way the Chinese represented Australia in their global times, and that's supposed to be Scott Morrison on the right. I don't think their cartoonist is that brilliant at sort of getting ScoMo's features, but nevertheless, we are the lackeys. Oh, do they? We're the lackeys to the Americans. That's what they want to portray. We're just doing what Joe Biden says, which seems rather surprising since Joe Biden's left of centre and Scott Morrison's right of centre, but that's the Chinese view. Many of you will not know this man, particularly our young people. This is former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating. Now, Keating is known to people of my age because he burnt holes in our pockets when he was Treasurer with 18% interest rates. But one of his great beliefs was that the 21st century was the Asian century, and Australia should forget its historic relationships with the UK, the US and concentrate on Chinese relationships and relationships with broader Asia. And recently he gave a speech saying, oh, the Liberals and Scott Morrison got it all wrong. The Chinese are lovely, lovely people, and we should be showing great love and kindness to the Chinese instead of upsetting them, because this is really where our future lies. Well, he might believe that, but I don't think that is what Bible prophecy is telling us. I don't think that's God's plan for Australia. So in the Bible, in Ezekiel 38, we have explained a great confederacy of nations from Russia and Europe that will invade the Middle East, the land of Israel, in the latter days. And this is an awful prophecy. It sends shudders down your spine to think there's going to be a confederacy of nations. The power of the north is going to come down upon God's land, the land of Israel. Now, that is where God's plan is working to. We won't turn to Ezekiel 38 because I think many in the audience will be familiar with this, and I can talk to you afterwards if you want more detail. Now, I will point out that in recent world events, the country of Ukraine is very much in the news at the moment. There's about 100,000 Russian troops camped on their border. And Mr. Putin says, look, don't misunderstand us. We're here for good reasons. We're going to help the people of Ukraine. Well, he's going to help himself. There's no doubt about that. Because Ukraine is in a part of territory in the Bible. We should go to Ezekiel 38 because it's only a few pages back in our Bible. We have this invading force from the north in verse 2 described as a force called Gog from the land of Magog. Gog, the one who is the roof, the one who pulls this confederacy together. And where does he come from? Magog. Where was Magog? We don't have this name in our atlases anymore. But Josephus said, and he was a Jewish historian, just around after the time of Christ, he wrote in his book called Antiquities, Magog founded the Magogites, who the Greeks called the Scythians. And just after Daniel's time, there was an historian called Herodotus, I think probably one of the oldest historians in the world, apart from when people wrote history on plaques, as the Babylonians and Assyrians did. And he said this area of Scythia, identified as Magog, stretched on the river Danube in Europe to the river Don on the borders of Russia. So just to get, it might seem a little hard to pick up the Danube. It comes out in the Black Sea and it goes up on the edge of Hungary and Romania and the Czech Republic up towards Berlin. The River Don is in Russia. It's easy to pick out. It starts from Rostov on just above the Black Sea and it goes up towards Moscow. So when we talk about Magog, we are talking of a territory basically from Berlin to Moscow and all the territory in between. This, says Ezekiel, will be the home base from which this invasion will start. It will come under the control of one great power called Gog, who will stretch across all this country. What does this country include? Well, it includes part of Russia, but it includes the Ukraine. It includes Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. And who is controlling this? Well, according to Ezekiel's clear message, it's one who is called in verse 2, Rosh. And we won't go into this in more detail tonight, but Rosh is believed to be the most ancient name of Russia. Gesenius, in his Bible lexicon, says it's undoubtedly the Russians. So here we have an assembly of nations who is under the control of Russia, and it stretches its home base from the Danube to the Don, across Europe. And I'm suggesting to you in 2022, we need to watch this power of the North consolidate this territory. Not only will Putin take the Ukraine, but he will move further east into Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic to basically take from Berlin to Moscow. Now, this picture of this great power of the North is called in the book of Daniel the King of the North. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 11. So Daniel chapter 11 describes the ongoing battles between the king of the south and a king of the north. Now these powers, a king of the north and a king of the south, emerged from the remnants of Alexander's rulership. When he died at that very young age, there were a series of generals in charge. One stage there were 4 generals controlling 4 territories, and eventually it came down to 2 generals controlling 2 great empires. One in the north called the Seleucid Empire, and one in the south, the Empire of the Ptolemies. And as Daniel 11 describes how the north and south fought it out for centuries. But Daniel 11 has particular applicability to our time, because we have described in verses 40 to 45 an invasion of the land of Israel. And point by point, this lines up with Ezekiel chapter 38. It is undoubtedly the same invasion. Undoubtedly, in my view. I can give you the evidence later if you want it. This describes a period in verse 40 called the time of the end. The time of the end. And in this time of the end, in chapter 12, verse 1, a great angel called Michael, who will stand up, who stands for the children of thy people, the people of Israel, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was. And in this period of time, in verse 2, there will be the resurrection of all dead believers through the preceding 6,000 years. And there will be rewards, and the wise, in verse 3, will receive blessing to be rulers in God's kingdom on earth. So this is events right at the end of human governments. And at this end time, in verse 40, the king of the south would push at him. Now, in the context of this chapter, the him is a king in verse 36. A king who ruled over the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople. And in the First World War, the king of the south pushed at him and pushed him out of the land of Israel altogether. Now, this event is also described by the Lord Jesus Christ in Revelation 16, the time when the northern kingdom under the Ottomans would evaporate and make way for the kings from the sun's rising. So at this time, a king from the south, and the south is Egypt, would push at him. So who pushed from the south? Well, it was the UK. It was Australia and the Australian light horse. And it was New Zealand. Of course, the Australians were the stars of this battle, the Battle of Beersheba. It was the Australian light horse that led the the incredible victory over the Ottoman Turks and ran across their territory, November 1917. So Australia participated in this victory of the King of the South pushing at him and drove the Ottoman Turk out of the land of Israel to make the way for the Jews to return to their own land. It was immediately followed by the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government agreed that the Jews could have a home in the land of Israel. But this pushing sees a reaction by one in verse 40 called the King of the North. A great power from the north will then come against him like a whirlwind. And this power from the north, in verse 41, shall enter the glorious land of Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown. So this is the same thing as Ezekiel 38, a power from the north. Now, in ancient times, the king of the north occupied from Afghanistan to Turkey, to Constantinople, and all the territory in between. And what we saw this year in the fall of Afghanistan, from the fall of Afghanistan government and the occupation by the Taliban, is the perfect entree for the Russians to take a step to make more control of Afghanistan. Seemingly not yet, but watch out in 2022, I suggest to you. The Russians have already consolidated a foothold in Syria. They stood with President Assad when everyone else went away from him. They have a strong relationship with what's called on our map Persia, or what we call today Iran. Putin works in close harmony with the Iranians. And the Iraqis will come on as part of this alliance as well. This power of the north. Now, this king of the north, king of the south stuff actually lines up with a split in the Arab world. Now, this is a map I got off the BBC site, but they look at the percentage of Sunni Muslims in the Middle East. Sunni Muslims were actually the most hard-line. The Wahhabis under the Saudi Arabians exported terror all over the world. But in the latter days, they are a power from the south. And across the north, we have the Shiite Muslims, Iran, Iraq, and I suggest to you increasingly Syria and Lebanon and Gaza. The Shiite Muslims will form a solid bloc, I would suggest to you, and the Shiites in the south will form another solid bloc. The Shiites will be in harmony with the power of the north, with Russia. The Sunnis will be in harmony with the power of the south, the UK and its confederates. This incredible split in the different groups within Islam is a key to understanding how this division happens. You might say Oman's a bit of an odd one out, but Oman is very rapidly getting on side with the West in any case. Let's come then to Ezekiel 38. Back to Ezekiel 38. And the 13th verse. Now, in the early verses, Ezekiel describes the incredible power of the north that will invade the land of Israel. We know it's Israel because we're told so in verse 8. They will come against the mountains of Israel. They will come against this land that has been brought back from captivity. What an incredible description of Israel. But in verse 13, as this power of the north amasses to invade Israel, there's an opposing force, and it's called in verse 13, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Have you gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? O European Confederacy, what are you doing? Have you come to take a spoil? We protest. This is not acceptable conduct. Well, who is these people, Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish? Well, if you pick a Bible dictionary off your shelf, and I looked at a few, they all had a similar message. The kingdom of Sheba is basically Yemen, right? So it's Yemen at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. So if we look at a map, there is Sheba at the very bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. What about Dedan? Well, again, if you look at a Bible dictionary or read your Bible, you'll find that Dedan is somewhere near the modern country of Jordan. But it actually has a split. There was one man called Dedan who settled on the Persian Gulf. And we've got that marked. That's the western or right-hand side is Dedan on the Persian Gulf. And this group of people called Dedan were traders in spices and other goods. In Ezekiel 27, we have mention of another Dedan, and they are located on the left-hand or eastern side of the peninsula. And these people were agriculturalists. So Dedan has come to represent the greater part of the Arabian Peninsula. Dedan stretches down into the Gulf states, Sheba the bottom part, and Dedan right across the Arabian Peninsula. So in Sheba and Dedan, we have described the Arabian Peninsula and the countries thereof. Now, we know the dominant country is Saudi Arabia, but in the south is Yemen and Oman, and in the Gulf we have Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, etc., UAE. So there's a series of countries that make up this territory today. Now, interestingly, when we look at these countries on a map, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman, we find a staggering preponderance of UK, US bases. Yes, it is true that you'll find some US, UK bases up in Turkey because Turkey is part of NATO. I suggest to you those bases will go. Turkey belongs to the King of the North. It's part of the Russian camp. But this influence of the US and the UK in the south is a sign of the times that we do well to take our awareness of. And this came very dramatically to the world's attention under Donald Trump in what was called the Abraham Accords. And Trump got to the White House, Benjamin Netanyahu, the then Prime Minister of Israel, pictured on Trump's right-hand side, our left, and he also had there the chiefs of Bahrain and of the UAE. And they signed these accords with Israel. Now, everyone thought the Arabs hated Israel. And now the UAE has an embassy in Israel. We cannot underestimate how dramatic this sign was that the Americans and the powers of Sheba and Dedan should be cooperating with Israel. Because in Ezekiel 38 verse 13, they protest that Israel is being invaded. Now, since August 2020, seems a long time, doesn't it, since Donald Trump was in power, but it's only a bit over a year ago. August 2020, this cooperation has grown and grown. It's grown under the influence of the British as well. Remember that former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was doing a lot of the spade work, even though he's a Labor Prime Minister, doing a lot of spade work for Trump in getting the Arabs on side. It was a UK-US alliance. Now, this move of bringing the territories to the south of Israel in alliance with the Western powers in Israel has only accelerated this year. So this week, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of UK, met with the Sultan of Oman in the territory of the Gulf states. And you will see that the UK has a plan to reach a trade involvement with the 6 Gulf states. So they want to form this alliance, this close alliance with the Dedan territories. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, just this week, met with the Sultan of Oman, Haitham bin Tariq Al Said, at Downing Street, and they moved forward the Oman trade deal. Okay, so that's Sheba and Dedan working together with Israel. But where does the West come in? Well, the West comes in the next phrase, the merchants of Tarshish. Now, when we read the Bible, especially Ezekiel 27, we find that Tarshish was a power that traded in tin and silver. It was a long way from Israel out to the west. Jonah was going to go from Israel, he's going to go across the Mediterranean as far as he could go to Tarshish. It was a place of merchants, and they had many ships. So we would expect this Tarshish power in the future to be based on Ezekiel 38, to be friendly towards Israel, to be friendly towards these southern Arab states, Sheba and Dedan, and have a clear presence in the Middle East. Now, I'm suggesting to you that this is the power of the UK, Britain, as an important power in our world. And you might say, oh, spent force, Britain's finished. No, in Bible prophecy, it has a role to play. And if we go back in history and we look at these Phoenicians who came from Lebanon, Tyre and Sidon, and they traded around the world, and the line stretches round to the UK, to Tarshish, where they got their iron and tin from. So the UK is represented by comics as the sleepy lion. It may be a sleepy lion, but in the last days it's going to have many young lions. Now just see the way the young lions has been used in history. We have war posters from the First World War. The empire needs men. Here's the old lion, and he's calling to the young lions, Australia, Canada, India and New Zealand. Up the top is a Canadian newspaper, and here Canada's being dragged along by the old lion. The bottom picture, responding to the call, and here we have all the young lions, Australia, South Africa, India. Now this isn't new to Christadelphian teaching. John Thomas, a Christadelphian, wrote about the connection between the UK and India as one of the young lions. But if we go back to 1885, in the Christadelphian magazine, we have this excerpt. The country resounds with preparations for the dispatch of troops. India is to contribute from 3,000 to 4,000, sounds pretty pitiful in today's terms. Australia, Canada and other British cubs. So Christadelphians have been talking about the British cubs for a long, long time. I think that's 136 years if my maths is roughly correct. A long time. Yeah? Australia, Canada and other British cubs with India. As they have been called, that is the British young lions, hastening to the neighbourhood of Armageddon. Later on, in 1899, what's that, only 122 years ago, Christadelphian author wrote, Canada, Africa, by which he means South Africa, Indian and Australian extremities of the British Empire respond as the extremities of the body to the will of the head. Decision of the British government to maintain at any cost the integrity of the empire. The great crisis in which all the young lions are to finally figure, we know is future on the mountains of Israel, but the present South African trouble prepares a situation for it. In every great war over the last 120 years, these powers have worked together. Britain, South Africa, India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This is the young lions cooperating with the old lion of Britain. Christadelphians wrote this 120 years ago, but I don't see any reason for us to change. These alliances are very strong. These are the alliances that won the First World War and the Second World War, and I don't exclude the Americans. I think they're a vital part of this young lion force. So this week, sorry for the chopping off Dan Tian's head, but that's the photographer's fault, not mine. But this week in London, Dan Tian, our Minister for Trade, signed a free trade agreement with Anne Trevally, the UK Minister. We are strongly in this together. Australia and India are building incredible ties as young lions. When China would not accept Australian coal, we shifted to India. Look at the massive jump from 2020, there's a little blob at the strip at the bottom, to 2021, where we're supplying 18% of India's coals, and I suggest to you it's even more next year. And we haven't suffered on price. The price of coal quadrupled from the start of the year to October. It's still double what it was at the start of the year. Australia has done very well out of its alliance with India. Just take the Queensland government's budget forecast. They are budgeting something like $24 billion, 24,000 million, yes, for the current year, and a quarter of their revenue comes from royalties, and most of that is coal royalties earned from India. We are not suffering. The Chinese might hate us, or the Chinese government might hate us. Chinese people don't. The Chinese government might, but it hasn't damaged us at all. Our relationship with India is growing. This year we embarked in what's called the Quad Alliance, which is Australia, India, US and Japan. So on the right-hand side we have the four flags in the Navy, Japan, US, Australia and India, working together. And on the left we have the ship that everyone's concerned about, which is China. But Australia is working with our strategic partners, which will form part of this group, which will oppose the King of the North. And there is Scott Morrison with Modi discussing more trade, more collaboration between Australia and India. So we are looking at events in which Australia is being inextricably drawn into a position of part of the southern domain, cooperating with Sheba and Dedan and Tarshish as a young lion to oppose the force of Russia and Europe. Am I staggered that Australia is annoying the French? Not at all. The French and Germans are part of this Northern Alliance. Will we annoy the Russians? Probably. Do we annoy the Chinese? Probably. The Chinese are not directly mentioned in Ezekiel 38, but clearly they're going to be a partner, a silent participant in this battle. They may stand aside, but their alliance with Russia, their cooperation with Russia, their support of Russia is going to be obvious. Australia is not going to be cooperating with China, I suggest to you, when the Lord Jesus Christ returns. Well, that was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but there is a grand plan. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar 2,500 years ago. In conclusion, I want to go to Psalm 2. So, people might say, this is not what we want Australia to do. We want Australia to be friends with Europe and China. But the angels have a different direction. Psalm 2, the writer says, why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain thing? Right? The kings of the earth and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against God himself, and against his anointed Christ. The psalm is prophesying a day when the nations will take on God and his Son, Jesus Christ. They will not want to be subject to their control. Verse 3, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. But when the nations want to get rid of God's control, in verse 4, God who sits in heaven shall laugh. Now, I am suggesting to you, when we look at the future role of Australia, it cannot do anything else but what the prophets suggest. If I am right that it is a young lion, then it must cooperate with the other powers, the Arab states of the south of Israel, cooperate with Israel, cooperate with its Western powers to stand together against this invading king of the north. There is no other path. Paul Keating can stand up in the National Press Club in Canberra and tell everyone that we should be getting on with China and Russia and all of Asia. He can speak what he likes. What will happen will be the angel's decision. See, in verse 6, God has a plan. I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Though the king of the north might invade the land of Israel and take his power upon Jerusalem, as Daniel 11 describes, yet the Lord Jesus Christ will be the eventual king in Jerusalem. He told us exactly that in Matthew 5. Swear not by Jerusalem, it is the city of the great king. God has a son who he will give all the power to. Verse 7, you are my son, this day have I begotten thee. And what am I going to give you, says God? Verse 8, I am going to give you the nations for your inheritance. Christ will receive power over all the nations. You will receive the uttermost parts of the earth. Do you know, I think that includes Australia, doesn't it? The uttermost parts of the earth, we're going to be given to Christ. I'm sorry for all these aspiring prime ministers of Australia, but eventually Christ will take control of Australia. And what will he do in verse 9? He will break the nations with a rod of iron. He shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Can you imagine a pot and standing there with an iron rod and just smashing it to pieces? That is what Christ will do to all the nations of the earth. And the psalmist suggests in verse 10, what the king should do is to be wise, to be instructed, to serve God, not themselves. Verse 12, to kiss God's Son, to humbly bow before the Lord Jesus Christ when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed indeed will they that put their trust in him. The future for Australia is to submit to Jesus Christ, not any prime minister, not any other nation, to submit to Jesus Christ and put their trust in him. I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, as we end this lecture, that we all try now to put our trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, the coming King.